Hi, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of My Words, Our Journey. Today, we'll begin with Chapter 10. It was 2 days later when her eyes opened to the sight of the women that had been at the hospital in shifts since her admittance. Even with the drugs that were slowly dripping into her veins, the pain was real and consuming. Madison could not remember what had happened to her until Megan began telling of the neighbors finding her unconscious on the foyer floor and how the doctors had said she must have fallen down the stairs after the attack, and how no one had seen Ryan since. As she was hearing the words, images flashed in her head: the dark figure in the doorway of her bedroom, the screaming, and the things being thrown at her head. And then, as the figure came closer and grabbed her, the face became clear. It was her husband, but in the shadows she had seen the twisted and sinister expressions. It was Ryan. It was Ryan, was all she had the strength to say, and from the reaction of the women that encircled the bed, it was no surprise to them. She watched as Sandy went outside and brought back in a police officer. She was whispering something, but Madison could not tell what they were saying. She wanted desperately to raise her arms and motion for a pen and paper, but could not will it to happen. So instead, she inhaled through the pain and one more time said, "It was my husband. It was Ryan that did this to me." With that, she closed her eyes, letting the drugs do their job, and she drifted off, knowing the women in the room would now look after her. Tammy and Sharon had suggested they take a break and grab a bite to eat before Madison regained consciousness. Needing to be said, and someone actually saying it were two different things entirely. And during their lunch, consisting of cafeteria salads and small talk, no one wanted to be the one to say it. Finally, Tammy reached across the table and took Sandy by the hand, looked directly in her eyes, and said, "I'm so sorry we didn't take you more seriously the other day. Speaking for myself, I just didn't want to hear what you had to say." She paused as if trying to decide if she should continue or not. "Now with this, and with what happened to Chelsea, well, now I think we better listen." Silence while Sandy looked around the table of friends minus two. She could see in each of their sets of eyes, this time, they were willing to listen. Even Megan had nodded in agreement. "If we're going to break free from the chains that bind each of us at this table, we're going to have to stand up and do it ourselves. The police and the courts have proven time and time again they don't have the time or the guts to look out for women who are being abused by their husbands." Pausing only to make sure no one was listening. "The court cases dismissed just in our surrounding counties in just the last few months would astonish you. Ladies, I'm putting this out there for each of you to consider. As someone asked at one of our first meetings, how much better would our lives be without our men in them? And do we have the guts to make the hard decisions and act upon them?" Stopping only long enough to take out a cigarette and then remembering she couldn't light it. "Each of us at this table will be at a funeral in 2 days for a young woman we could not save. And today we stood beside the bed of a friend who we couldn't shelter from evil. I guess what I want each of you to think about is what will it take for each of us to take action against those that threaten us and our families on a day-to-day basis. And have we reached that point now?" Looking around the table, she knew it was time to close. There was not a dry eye amongst the group, including her own. Will we agree as a group to move forward together towards independence, or will we wait until we go to another funeral or spend another night in a hospital? Sharon was the first to speak. "I don't want to end up like this, or worse." Each voiced similar sentiments, including Megan, and as a group, they decided to think about things and talk once Madison was well and out of the hospital. Chapter 11. Leonard was the first to arrive. If the parking lot was any indication, his restaurant choice was spot on. He watched as three young couples passed arm in arm, laughing and giggling. So much to learn about life and disappointment, he thought. Families pass too. Leonard was not envious, but rather curious about how that must feel. Did the men take what they had for granted? Sure they did. Checking his watch and retrieving his keys, Leonard stepped out into the brisk Virginia air. In front of him, a group of young ladies, each tall and wearing outfits not appropriate to be out in public, he thought. as he walked towards the front doors. Leonard stopped at the bar just inside. As he looked around the crowded room, he did not see his friends, so he motioned for the tattooed bartender to bring him a drink. Not long after he was handed his rum and coke, he saw Shawn come through the door. Jill must have picked him out a new outfit for the occasion, and she had done well. Shawn made eye contact with Leonard at the same time because a smile came across his face as he made his move towards the bar. Over handshakes, small talk, and a drink in his hand, they waited for Kenny. Kenny entered before the second round could be consumed, and the three were seated promptly. Leonard was proud of that fact. It was funny, but in some small way, he took credit for the service they were being afforded. The conversation over stuffed mushrooms and loaded potato skins ranged from sports to politics, to the war, and back to sports again, to the case they had shared and the experiences, and then back to sports. There was never a clear moment for Shawn or Leonard to segue into the news they both desperately wanted to share. Finally, when he couldn't take it any longer, Shawn blurted out, "I got a promotion a few weeks back. It's no big deal, really, but I just wanted you guys to know. And for the 300th time, thanks again for letting me work on the case with you. I know it helped with the new job." He raised his short glass and waited for the others to follow suit. When they did, Leonard surprised the others with his news and his timing. "I've decided to retire. Can somebody pass me the skins?" Chapter 12. Madison felt funny in the wheelchair, bordered by her friends and the two nurses that accompanied them as they made their way towards the elevator. She was not used to such treatment. Now, for over a week, she had felt like the center of attention. Ryan had still not been found, and she was not entirely sure she was ready to go back to their home. The policemen that had been watching her door during the evening hours had mentioned they would be patrolling her neighborhood for a while to make sure everything was okay. Madison knew, however, everything was not going to be okay. If Ryan was able at all, he would make sure she paid for bringing such attention to him. She would pay. When they were alone, waiting at the curb, Megan spoke to Madison, so low she had to struggle to hear. "Do you feel up to going out with us for lunch? We have a few things we want to discuss with you, if you're feeling well enough. It's kind of important." Madison did feel well enough, and even if she hadn't, she was dying to know what was going on. After ordering their food and watching the waitress disappear into the back, the discussion started. First, Sandy filled her in on the conversation at the hospital cafeteria. Then Megan brought her up to speed on what the group had discussed over breakfast that very morning. Basically, the group had agreed it was time to take action against their oppressors. Heads nodded and voices echoed in agreement as Megan told of how they had come to the conclusion they were prepared to murder their husbands to save their lives, those of their children, and the lives of their new friends. They sat in quiet anticipation as they waited for Madison's response. Instead, all they got was a blank stare. Finally, when it was clear Madison did not know what to say, Tammy spoke for the group. "Think long and hard about your answer, sweetie, because we know where your husband is, and we want him to be first." She was wrong. Madison was not ready for this lunch, and she was definitely not ready for this conversation. "Our food is coming. We can talk about something else over lunch, can't we?" Sharon asked. Madison was thankful for the waitress's timing, but the words kept bouncing around in her head. "We want him to be first." After the dirty plates had been removed and before the dessert, she was ready to reopen the talks. First and foremost, how could they know where her husband was? Sharon was ready to retell the tale, so she took Madison back to the day of the attack. It was the initial call from the neighbor that had put the wheels in motion. Tammy, when home or in the car, never was without her police scanner, and she had heard the call immediately. From the address and the description of the scene, she had known to call Megan. Megan, as soon as she hung up with Tammy, was back on the phone calling the others. They had to work fast. They had heard enough about each other's spouses that they knew it would be easy for the girls to pick him out of a crowd. Megan, however, did not think they would have to go to that trouble. What would a wife-beater need after a vicious attack? A drink and probably a smoke. There were plenty of places to buy cigarettes. Lucky for them right now, though, however, there were only a few places to get a drink, and fewer if you were looking to buy and go. Within minutes, the women had left their homes and headed out, armed with only their keys and their cell phones. And it didn't take long. Sandy spotted him even before he walked out of Spat's Gas and Go. Through the large window, she could clearly see him waiting second in line, calm and collected, holding a six-pack of beer. No one inside would have guessed he had just nearly beat his wife to death, and a part of her just wanted to run in and shout that fact at the top of her lungs. Megan, however, had proposed a different scenario, the one she liked better. Quickly dialing, she passed along the amazing news, which was passed on down the line. When her phone rang back, Tammy was watching Ryan get into his late model Honda, concentrating so hard the ringing of the phone made her jump out of her skin. From here, she would follow him and stay on the line with Sharon, guiding her towards the directions. Their guess was that he would not be going home or anywhere in public. And they were right. Just outside of town, towards the east, there was a pull-off that looked over the side of the prettiest rolling hills, greenest pastures, and clearest skylines. When Ryan turned right onto State Route 12, they knew where he would be driving and drinking alone. With that information, Sharon was on her way. On the weekends, there would be at least 20 cars parked along the guardrails. That night, there was only one, and its driver was sitting on the trunk with a beer bottle in one hand and his chin on the other. Ryan was looking down at the gravel drive, paying no attention to the automobile that had broken the silence. Sharon was never afraid during the episode. She was too upset and angry from hearing the news about Madison. In fact, it had taken everything she had to hold back from just walking up to the villain, kicking him off the car, and pounding him until he was part of the earth. Instead, as she closed the driver's side of her car, she adjusted her skirt and began walking towards the oblivious man. She wondered if this would actually work. When she was close and Ryan finally lifted his head, the first thing she noticed was his eyes. Not only were they bloodshot, which she would have expected, but they were the kind of an animal way about them that she would have not been able to explain later to the others. The anger she felt pushed her forward. "Oh, I'm sorry," acting startled. "I thought you were somebody else," looking around for effect, but also to make sure they were truly alone. The man before her never said a word and barely acknowledged she was even there. There was no way for Sharon to know if her 6-week training course in defensive maneuvering would pay off. She had practiced since the classes last summer, but never in a situation like the one she was in now. Without warning, and while her victim was taking another draw on his beer, Sharon let fly with what she called her kick of doom. There was nothing fancy about the move, but out of her small frame, Sharon could pack quite a wallop. Her tennis shoe hit squarely on his chin. It was not where she had aimed, but it was effective. Ryan went peacefully to the ground. Sharon knew Megan had requested she take this part of the mission for several reasons. Two of the top on the list, she would not back out, and she could get every ounce of power and strength out of what God had given her. There was no concern from her for his well-being when she dragged Ryan face down from where he fell to the trunk of her car. Neither did she flinch when she dropped him head first onto the toolbox her husband had brought her last birthday. Madison could not believe what she was hearing. They had kidnapped her husband? For what purpose? And what was he doing? And where was he? And what would he do when he was set free? Tammy stopped Sharon and asked Madison if she was okay. When Madison told them to continue, Tammy looked at Sharon as if to say, "Speed things up just a little bit." "Ryan is at Old Man Tinney's decrepit old barn out on Highway 117, where no one will find him. We want to take you out there," Megan interrupted. "The group had just decided you should be first." Madison spoke for the first time in a while. As Madison watched those around her begin to prepare to leave, she spoke. "I have a few questions before I go anywhere." Everyone stopped and gave her their undivided attention. "First, how are you managing to get away from the house so easy these days? And second, you want me to be the first to do what?" When she paused and looked from face to face, she was not sure anyone was going to answer her. Chapter 13. With all the news flying around, Kenny was tempted to shout out his as well. He just knew it wouldn't sound any better out loud than it did in his head. "I found the woman I want to marry. She just doesn't know it yet. Actually, we're not even dating." So instead, he sipped his drink, laughed at the appropriate time, and listened to how well life was going for Shawn and Leonard. He was happy for them. They were two of the good ones. Promotions and retirements were things he looked forward to in the future. Right now, however, he could not think about anything past Rachel, and part of him welcomed that, while another part was sad the old Kenny was dying and be replaced by a whipped puppy. He rejoined the conversation when he heard Shawn talking about how his department, the one he was now leading, would be concentrating on serial killers. The Miles Humphreys case had indeed touched the lives of each of the men sitting in the dimly lit corner of the restaurant. Leonard had decided after working to solve the big case, he had seen enough, and it was time to sit back and enjoy his remaining days. The case had propelled Shawn's career to a new and exciting level, a place where Kenny could tell his friend would flourish. And for him, the case had shown him he needed to find a purpose in life other than his work. He did not want to end up like Miles Humphreys. When reading the background of the defender of children, one fact kept repeating itself: no friends and no one to spend his life with after the death of his wife. Kenny was not prepared to face a future where he found himself in anything close to a life like that. Instead, he would choose to cherish the few friends he had and move away from the Playboy games and mindset towards a more grown-up approach to life. Spending time with the two men he had half listened to now was part of that growing up process. There were things about each, in their stages of life, he would draw from, he decided. This had been a good idea. This time, when he rejoined the conversation, the topic had changed. Leonard was describing several tools he thought Shawn may be interested in, since Leonard was no longer going to need them. He would not be mowing any time soon. Kenny could not tell if Shawn was truly interested or just being polite. The description of the two steel weed eaters did catch his attention, though. He almost wished he had a yard. Leonard finished talking about what he intended to sell or give away, and went straight into giving the pros and cons of two different marinas he was having difficulty choosing between. Still, he couldn't tell if Shawn was truly paying attention, or if he was just that good. When given the opportunity, Kenny jumped in and asked Leonard if he could plan his next vacation to come visit. Kenny explained he'd always wanted to experience marina life, and had never had the opportunity. It had been a good move on his part, he could tell at once. Leonard was overjoyed by the idea. Chapter 14. The ride could only be described as void of conversation. Bumpy, full of anxiety, and long, and filled with considerable dread and despair. No one was truly ready for this. Not one had experienced anything even remotely close, and the unknown was freaking each out in their own way. On the flip side, everyone minus Madison felt sure the group had started down the road to recovery and freedom. A lengthy and difficult road, but they had to start somewhere. Within the hour, this should be over, and they would be heading home, each just a little stronger and a little better able to handle their own situation. The last mile, Madison became very calm, almost to the point of not being able to breathe. The women she had bonded with so easily now expected her to kill the man she had vowed to honor and cherish forever in the sight of God. When she looked into his eyes, she knew this would not be possible. Then what? She had been mad enough to think evil thoughts about her husband on numerous occasions, but the fact that he could have killed her did not elude her. But Madison had decided long ago that if there was a hell, Ryan would sit close to the flame and be punished for his actions for eternity, and she was okay with that end result. Until then, she had no intention of helping him meet his end, no matter how he treated her. Besides, maybe she would find the strength to leave him now, or maybe he would not even want her back after all this, she thought. Still, she did not speak. Still, she would wait without protest until she stood before Ryan. It was her hope they could work through this, so all could leave the barn feeling better about things, like no one being murdered. At first, she had thought that some kind of weird or sick joke, but she knew now that wasn't the case. These women would have to win an Oscar or something if this just turned out to be a prank. She could only hope for the best at this point. They were getting close. She could feel it by the way Sharon drove and by the angst that now filled the car, like a cold, thick fog that rolled over her. Maybe this would have a semi-happy ending? Maybe. At least she would keep telling herself that, until it didn't. Ryan could hear the cars approaching. Confused, he was not sure how he should feel. Was he being rescued? Or was he about to be beaten again? Or worse? He remembered very little since leaving the house after his fight with Madison. Still, he hadn't thought of her much, if at all, or her well-being. Time had gone by slowly while alone in the run-down old barn. He had filled his time working on two tasks, trying to figure out why he was there and working on the thick ropes that were around his ankles, wrists, thighs, waist, and shoulders. Whoever did this to him made good and sure he wouldn't escape. He could hear the sound of the approaching footsteps. If he was correct, it sounded like several people were about to enter the barn, where he waited, now with anticipation. At least he may have answers to one of his questions. The splash of fresh air that washed over his face was a welcome surprise, followed by the realization that the footsteps he had heard all along belonged to women. What the fuck? When the four entered the front entrance and split, two to the left and two to the right, that left one entering from the center. It was Madison. Now any fear and confusion was instantly replaced with anger. What did she think this little game would accomplish? The sweat that fell into his eyes did not hurt nearly as deep as the hatred he felt in his heart. First, you're going to untie me. Then, if you're lucky, we'll discuss this like rational adults, you stupid bit. Before he could finish calling her one of his favorite pet names, Madison interrupted. To think after all you've put me through, I still came here to take you home. She stopped and looked around at the four ladies that had brought her here to confront her demons. Home. Home where you left me for dead. Home where you beat me. Not wanting to cry, but having no choice, she just let it all out. Home where I should feel safe, but instead home is where I feel the least safe at all. Ryan could not believe what he was hearing. What had these four women put in her head that made her think she could talk and act like this towards him? We can talk about what happened the other night when we get home, in private. But if I'm not out of this barn in a minute, well, I just can't be held responsible for what I may do. That had been the wrong thing for him to say, and he knew it instantly by his wife's reaction. Stepping in closer, he could see her fresh bruises for the first time. He could tell by her posture he had hurt her bad. Slowly and very deliberately she spoke. Do you understand these women brought me here to end this? To stop you for good? He watched as Madison spoke briefly to one of the women and then moved towards him. Not wanting to risk saying anything that would stop her, he laid in silence. Ryan could feel the restraints loosening around his torso. It would not be long until he was free and able to let his lovely wife know exactly how he felt about her and her new friends. As Madison untied the last ropes around his legs, she whispered to him, I hope we can use this as a way for us to get better, for healing. I truly would like to make our marriage work, Ryan. Walking away, she hoped and prayed she was wrong. Tears welled in her eyes. She could only wait to see what would happen next. Ryan was moving behind her. She heard the chair land across the barn, the yelling at Megan, Sandy, Tammy, and Sharon, demanding them to leave, and finally the heavy steps moving in her direction. Turn around and face me. She could hear the evil in his voice. It was the same tone she had heard the night he stood in the doorway before his last brutal attack. Slowly, she forced herself to turn. It was not what she wanted. No, she wanted to run as fast and as far as her tired legs would allow her. Facing him, she could see what she already knew. Ryan was enraged and not going to make this easy. He was in her face almost instantly, yelling and proclaiming his dominance over her and promising in graphic detail how she would pay for her disobedience. It was when he cocked his right hand, preparing to throw his first punch of the evening, when she noticed the movement behind them. With the grace of a gazelle, Sharon took both legs out from under Ryan, leaving him dazed, confused, and even more pissed off. In his rage, he had forgotten the women behind him. The remaining women did not give him a chance to recover. They were on him instantly, kicking repeatedly, high and low, one blow after another. No one said a word, including Madison, who watched from just outside the circle. She had asked Megan to intervene only if she felt Madison was in danger, and now she watched as the man she thought, to the end, would somehow change for her, scrum and squeamish on the ground, defending himself the best he could from the barrage of blows. When she had made eye contact with Megan, she nodded and turned, heading outside, away from her past. Whatever lay ahead for Madison, she would accept. She would find peace with what she had done somehow, someday. He had left her no choice. Ryan knew it was its end. The outside was in extreme pain. The inside was turning to mush, and his head could not take much more punishment before it completely shut down. He was sure of it. The woman he had always considered weak had chosen to be strong. He never would have guessed. Barely conscious, he sensed they were slowing down the onslaught, only to be surprised when his feet were lifted and he was dragged across the ground with his head banging as he went. He heard the sound of the trap door, but he did not know what it meant until he was dragged to the edge and thrown down into what was once a storage area of some sort underneath the barn. Ryan could hear the footsteps and assumed they were leaving, giving him a moment of hope. A moment too short-lived, however. One set of steps returned. With his face swollen and eyes nearly shut, he could only sense that there was something being tossed down in the space he occupied, not knowing for sure until he smelled and felt the warmth of the fire. The bed of old straw and dried wood he was thrown upon was now in flames. His limbs had failed him when he fell. There was no hope, only regret. He should have killed her when he had the chance, he thought. When the cars began to pull away from the barn, Madison was dying inside, dying to ask what had happened when she left, dying to know if he had said anything, dying to know what they had planned next, and dying to jump out of the car and run back to Ryan. A reaction that was certain would kill her, either by blood vessels, stroke. Glancing back through the rearview mirror, aware of the others monitoring her every move, she could see the smoke and flames starting to make their way through every opening in the old and dried up barn. One thing was for sure, it would burn to the ground within minutes, taking with it anything left inside. What a way to go, she thought. Flames. It was late, and Madison wondered how each of her traveling companions would be treated when they arrived home. For her, the answer would be easy: an empty house, filled with emotions and regrets. While the other, now murderers, headed home, each tried to keep their feelings in check. None could guess how this would play out. And that concludes Season 2, Episode 3. I hope you're enjoying the journey. Thank you, and have a great day.